Welcome to the 2022 Philadelphia Prenatal Conference. I'm Dr. Warren Hern. I'm director of the Boulder Abortion Clinic. Dr. Giefman-Holtzman has asked me to speak to you, my friends and colleagues, about the history of abortion in the United States and the current situation concerning abortion services. Aside from the medical issues that concern you and your patients, the abortion issue is now more contentious and controversial than ever in American history. The U.S. Supreme Court, which made access to safe abortion a constitutional right for American women in 1973 with the Roe v. Wade decision, is now poised to overturn that decision. This will turn the regulation of abortion back to the states, most of which are controlled by the Republican Party. This is important because the Republican Party is officially opposed to safe, legal abortion, and it has been determined since 1974 to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision. This extraordinary turn of events is remarkable, but it is not surprising. That's what I will be talking to you about today. As everyone in this group knows, women have sought and obtained abortions for thousands of years and have attempted to perform abortions on themselves regardless of the danger. Anthropologist George Devereaux studied 400 tribal societies and found that women in all these societies had abortions by various means. This has always been a part of women's culture, and abortions have been performed by birth attendants in cultures throughout the world. In the United States, abortion was widely practiced in colonial society and in the early years of the American Republic. In the 19th century, the medical profession sought to prohibit and limit access to abortion services by traditional midwives and birth attendants on the grounds that it was more dangerous than childbirth, but also because physicians saw traditional birth attendants as competition for physicians in caring for women. Most abortion laws were passed after the U.S. Civil War in the mid-19th century, and the Comstock laws later restricted access both to abortion and to information about contraceptive methods. Traditional herbal remedies for contraception and abortion passed out of common knowledge. In the early 20th century, Margaret Sanger was so horrified by the deaths of young women with children from unsafe abortion that she set about to make contraceptives widely available in order to prevent unplanned pregnancies and abortion. These historical facts are reviewed in detail in numerous excellent books, including David Garrow's Liberty and Sexuality and Leslie Reagan's When Abortion Was a Crime. During the middle of the 20th century, illegal abortions were widely available in the United States and being performed by physicians, but principally by unlicensed lay practitioners. Several key accounts of this have been written by historian Ricky Solinger in such books as Wake Up Little Susie and Abortion Wars. More recent works include Sarah Weddington's A Matter of Choice and Joanna Schoen's Abortion After Roe. Some obstetrician gynecologists and public health physicians increasingly regarded abortion as an urgent public health issue because of the thousands of women who were dying each year from unsafe abortion. The effects of laws restricting access to illegal abortion fell most heavily on the poor and on minority groups. The death rate due to unsafe abortion at that time was 9 times higher for black women than it was for white women. In New York City, the proportion of maternal mortality due to unsafe abortion was 50% for black women and over 60% for Puerto Rican women. That proportion was much smaller for white women. White women were much more likely to be able to obtain a safe illegal abortion from physicians. In the 1950s, there was an important movement headed by physicians such as Alan Guttmacher to make abortion both safe and legal. The movement spread across the country, and in 1967, Colorado became the first state to make abortion legal. An abortion reform bill was offered in the Colorado House of Representatives by freshman Democratic legislator Dick Lamb, sponsored in the Colorado Senate by Republican Senator John Birmingham, and signed into law by Republican Governor John Love. Soon after this, several other states either repealed existing laws against abortion or passed reform abortion laws similar to the one in Colorado. In 1970, the state of New York made abortion legal with some limitations. Just prior to these changes, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1965 in the Griswold versus Connecticut decision that married couples could legally have access to contraception. This was followed by other important Supreme Court decisions of Baird versus Bellotti and Eisenstadt versus Baird, which stated that minors could have access to contraception. In 1973, citing these previous decisions and citing the right to privacy, due process, and equal protection under the law, the Supreme Court handed down the Roe versus Wade decision, and that made abortion legal throughout the United States and nullified all laws against abortion. The reaction of the Catholic Church was immediate and resulted in a declaration by the National Conference of Catholic Bishops denouncing the Roe versus Wade decision and setting forth the objective of overturning it as soon as possible. At the same time, Protestant Christians were not very interested in the abortion issue. In fact, some conservative Protestant groups supported legal abortion and made statements to that effect. Protestants tended to regard this as a Catholic issue. The number of deaths due to unsafe abortion in New York City fell to 0 within 2 years after the Roe decision was handed down. Dr. Ward Cates of the Centers for Disease Control documented this dramatic national public health success in a paper published in Science in 1982. My own involvement in women's health care and abortion began in medical school in 1963. My first rotation was on obstetrics, and I loved delivering babies. It was a miracle, and I enjoyed seeing the women happy to welcome their child into the world. But I also saw the sadness and anguish of women who were getting prepared to give up their babies for adoption, as it was called then. I watched these women standing at the window by the nursery looking at their baby for the last time. They were grief-stricken and sobbing. I thought there was something terribly wrong with this situation. On my next clinical service, gynecology, I would spend all night long with my classmates taking care of women who were desperately sick from having had an unsafe, illegal abortion, although I really didn't understand what was going on until later. On pediatrics, I took care of children who were physically abused by their parents because they were unwanted. Dr. Henry Kemp, our department chair, identified the battered child syndrome and succeeded in getting laws passed to protect children. But it was clear that unwantedness was often a fatal condition for young children and produced other problems later in life. Working as a medical student running a small hospital in the Peruvian Amazon in 1964, I witnessed the same things and delivered babies who were about to die because of poor prenatal care. After graduation from medical school in Colorado, I did my rotating internship at Gorgas Hospital in the Canal Zone, where I saw more of these same problems. As a Peace Corps physician in Brazil from 1966 to 1968, the Brazilian doctors told me of the epidemic of deaths from unsafe abortion. One of my Brazilian colleagues took me through the maternity hospital, where there was one ward full of women recovering from childbirth and 2 wards full of women suffering from the effects of unsafe abortion. 50% of the women in the abortion wards died because they were too sick to save by the time they got to the hospital. At a 1967 Planned Parenthood conference in Santiago, Chile, I heard presentations on the deaths of women from unsafe abortion, and I met Dr. Rolando Armijo, a Chilean physician who had written about this major public health problem. Studying public health at the University of North Carolina, I learned that unsafe abortion was the principal cause of maternal mortality among women in the childbearing age range in Latin America. From North Carolina, I was recruited to help run the Office of Economic Opportunity Family Planning Division in Washington, D.C., where our charge was to help hundreds of thousands of poor women across the country have access to family planning programs. I got death threats under my apartment door from white supremacists in Atlanta. On December 13, 1971, I was present when Sarah Weddington argued the Roe v. Wade case for the first time before the U.S. Supreme Court. Nixon was supportive of family planning services, but not so much of abortion and sterilization services. The National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, NARAL, had been organized and was working to repeal all abortion laws. It was a major focus of other organizations such as the National Organization for Women and the Women's National Abortion Action Committee, WANAC. I was in close touch with the organizers of all these activities. As a federal medical officer at OEO, I worked with Dr. Christopher Tietze and others to prepare standards for abortion services for the American Public Health Association, and I participated in the 1971 New York International Conference on Abortion Techniques and Services. At that time, there seemed no legal threat to safe abortion services in the United States that could not be overcome. Many abortions were performed in New York City, and the U.S. military permitted abortions to be performed for American women in the military service. In 1972, after guidelines that I had prepared for OEO to protect poor women from sterilization abuse were suppressed by the Nixon White House, I resigned and returned to Colorado. That fall, my article, The Politics of Abortion, appeared in the Progressive magazine, in which I described the public health issues of unsafe abortion and the need to repeal abortion laws. I began preparing to return to graduate school to study epidemiology. After the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down on January 22, 1973, letters attacking the decision appeared in the Denver Post, among other newspapers. I wrote letters to the editor supporting the decision. That spring, the editor of the Denver Post asked to have lunch with me and asked me to explain this decision to him, which I did to the best of my ability. He then asked me to write an editorial about the subject, which I did. About the time of its publication, a group in Boulder, Colorado, called and asked me if I would help them establish a private, nonprofit abortion clinic in Boulder. I replied that I would, met with the group, and became the founding medical director of the clinic, which was the first one in Colorado. We began seeing patients during the first week of November in 1973. Within 2 weeks, I began receiving death threats in the night at my home in the mountains. I began sleeping with a rifle by my bed, and I assumed that I would be assassinated as I arrived at my home or as I was leaving my home. While there were a few members of the Boulder medical community that were supportive of what we were doing, there was generally overwhelming hostility from the medical community. There were numerous attempts by the, quote, Fight the Abortion Clinic Committee and other organizations to have us shut down. We defeated those efforts. During 1974, there were many demonstrations against the existence of the clinic, and the controversy became the focus of local television programming, including a debate between me and the leader of the anti-abortion protests in Boulder, a family physician who had met Jesus on a park bench in Chicago. A protocol for first trimester abortions began on the first day with a clinical history, laboratory work, physical exam, and placement of a single laminaria tent in the cervix to accomplish gradual and atraumatic cervical dilation overnight. I chose this method of cervical dilation over forceful dilation with metal dilators because I thought it was safer, would give better dilation, and reduce the risk of both uterine perforation and retained products of conception. The need for supplemental manual dilation with Pratt dilators was minimal, and blood loss was minimal during a 1-minute vacuum aspiration abortion followed by small forceps exploration and gentle, sharp curettage. We had few complications of any kind. One day, as I entered the operating room to do a physical exam on a patient scheduled for laminary placement that day and her procedure the next day, I found a young woman in her 30s who was terrified and trembling with fear. I remember her well. She had red hair. Before going ahead with her physical exam, I stopped and asked her to tell me why she was so frightened. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Tell me how you feel." She looked at me and said, "It's so different. You're a doctor. The lights are on. The windows are open." She then told me of her illegal abortion years before that. It was the most terrifying and humiliating experience of her life. "Don't ever stop doing this," she said. In 1974, U.S. Republican Senator Bob Dole was running for re-election in Kansas. His opponent was Dr. Bill Roy, a Topeka obstetrician-gynecologist who had delivered thousands of babies and who had performed a handful of abortions for medical reasons. Dr. Roy was also a lawyer serving his second term as the U.S. representative from Topeka. On Labor Day, 2 months before the election, Dr. Roy was ahead of Dole by 10 points. During a joint appearance at a county fairground, Dole accused Dr. Roy of being in favor of, quote, abortion on demand, a thought that had not occurred to Dr. Roy. From that point, Dole and his allies painted Dr. Roy in the most negative terms and trumpeted Dole's accusation. Dole won the election by 1 percentage point. The Republicans knew that they had found an issue for winning elections. Also in 1974, Paul Weyrich, Terry Dolan, and Howard Phillips, who represented the New Right in Republican politics, decided that they would try to get the Southern racists away from the Democrats and bring them into the Republican Party. The white Christian evangelicals were enraged with court-ordered busing and racial integration in the schools. The advocacy of racial segregation and apartheid was not a respectable issue in America, so the New Right chose abortion as its organizing issue, along with opposition to school busing, opposition to gun control, advocacy of prayer in the schools, and other issues dear to religious fundamentalists. They found an eloquent ally in Francis Schaeffer, a zealous white Christian evangelical religious leader who was horrified by the Roe v. Wade decision, and his son Frank. They also recruited Reverend Jerry Falwell, a fundamentalist white Christian evangelical pastor in Virginia, and Pat Robertson, an attorney and evangelical religious leader who developed a religious television network and programming that was widely popular with religious conservatives. These leaders brought the white supremacists from the American South into the Republican Party and cultivated increasingly fanatic opposition to abortion as being against the will of God. In 1972, North Carolina, one of the original Confederate slaveholding states, elected Jesse Helms as their new U.S. Senator. Helms was a television station owner and entrepreneur who regularly included racist rants of his own and those from tobacco-stained Ku Klux Klansmen on his television programs, which I watched as a graduate student at the University of North Carolina School of Public Health. As U.S. Senator, Helms became an enthusiastic ally of the New Right and anti-abortion fanatics. He sponsored the 1973 Helms Amendment, which prohibits the use of U.S. funds for abortion services in international health programs assisted by the American government. Helms became one of the most outspoken and aggressive opponents of abortion in the American Congress, and he dominated the 1980 Republican National Convention, which nominated Ronald Reagan for president and passed a strongly anti-abortion platform. In 1976, in response to efforts in the Colorado legislature to restrict access to abortion services, I organized the Western Regional Conference on Abortion. It was the first national conference on abortion since 1971, and it led directly to the formation of the National Abortion Federation, a non-profit association of abortion clinics and agencies interested in the policy aspect of abortion services. In the same year, the Hyde Amendment, prohibiting the use of U.S. funds for abortion for poor women, was passed into law. The sponsor, Henry Hyde, candidly stated that poor people were represented less than others and that he could therefore succeed in passing this legislation against their interests. In 1978, U.S. Democratic Senator Dick Clark ran for re-election in Iowa. Although he was popular and highly favored to win over a lackluster Republican candidate, he was beaten at the polls because of a ferocious campaign against him by opponents of abortion, who circulated 300,000 anti-abortion leaflets against him in the waning days of the campaign. Once again, the Republicans found their issue. During this time, anti-abortion fanatics began a campaign of violent attacks on abortion clinics throughout the country. The first was the Bill Baird Clinic in Hempstead, Long Island, which was destroyed by fire in 1979. In 1980, with Senator Jesse Helms now dominating the Republican Party, the Republican National Convention nominated Ronald Reagan for president. At the same convention, the leaders of Republican Women for Choice, Mary Dent Crisp, was thrown out of the National Convention. The party platform called for a human life amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would declare that an embryo, a blastocyst, was a person with all the constitutional rights of an adult person. The U.S. Constitution, by contrast, states that a person exists from the moment of live birth. From that point, the Republican Party concentrated on abortion as a winning political issue for winning elections, although that effort began in earnest in 1974. The day after Ronald Reagan won the election with the strong support of anti-abortion Republicans, his first comment to the press was, "I'm going to make abortion illegal." 2 days later, Republican U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina stated on the Today Show that he would seek the death penalty for doctors who performed abortions. I watched these pronouncements from my mountain home in Colorado and wondered what it would do to my life. Violent attacks on abortion clinics and doctors' offices continued. In 1984, 24 abortion clinics and offices were firebombed and destroyed. William Webster, head of the FBI, declared that the attacks were not terrorism because, quote, "we don't know who's doing it," unquote. The violent anti-abortion attacks on clinics and doctors continued and became worse. Anti-abortion demonstrations and invasions, headed by Randall Terry and Joe Scheidler, a defrocked Catholic monk, became increasingly aggressive across the country, and my clinic was one of the targets. Scheidler came numerous times to my office in Boulder from his Chicago Pro-Life Action League office to harass my patients and threaten me. Randall Terry stood in the street in front of my office, surrounded by his followers, and prayed for my execution. He later went on National Christian Radio Broadcasting Network and, citing scripture and my name, called for my execution. In 1993, Dr. David Gunn was assassinated at point blank range by Michael Griffin in Pensacola, Florida. Griffin was defended by lawyers Joe Scarborough, who used his anti-abortion support to be elected as a Republican to Congress, and from there was propelled to fame as the host of Morning Joe on MSNBC. Later that year, Shelley Shannon flew from Spokane, Washington to Oklahoma City, where she bought a pistol, and then drove to Wichita, Kansas to shoot Dr. George Tiller as he was driving out of his clinic parking lot. While serving time in Kansas State Prison, Shannon wrote to me to tell me that I was next. In 1994, at the same Pensacola, Florida abortion clinic, Reverend Paul Hill assassinated Dr. John Britton with a shotgun at point-blank range, killing Dr. Britton's bodyguard also, and critically injuring the bodyguard's wife. Hill, a Christian evangelical pastor, was part of a group that called itself the, quote, American Coalition of Life Activists, unquote, started by a Reverend David Trush, a Catholic priest in Alabama, who circulated a statement that killing doctors who do abortions is, quote, justifiable homicide, unquote. Hill was sentenced to death and executed. Anti-abortion fanatics consider him a revered martyr. During this time, the physician owner of the Pensacola abortion clinic was assassinated in Alabama. On October 23, 1998, Dr. Barnett Slepian was assassinated by James Kopp near Buffalo, New York, where Dr. Slepian, an obstetrician gynecologist, performed abortions at a local clinic. Dr. Slepian was shot in the back as he stood in his kitchen talking with his family with his back to the window. Kopp used an AK-47 assault rifle to kill Dr. Slepian. This is the same weapon and tactic that he used in shooting Dr. Gary Romalis in Vancouver in 1984, as Dr. Romalis was in his kitchen making toast for his wife. Kopp fired the weapon from a few dozen yards away, and the high-powered rifle nearly severed Dr. Romalis' leg. On May 31, 2009, Dr. George Tiller was acting as an usher for his fellow worshipers at his Lutheran church in Wichita, Kansas, when Scott Roeder, who had stalked Dr. Tiller for years, walked up to him and shot Dr. Tiller in the head, killing him instantly. Dr. Tiller was a close friend of mine as well as a medical colleague. The picture of Dr. Tiller on the Wikipedia page about him shows him smiling with someone's hand and arm over his shoulder. The hand is mine, and the photo was taken outside the Tiller condo in the Colorado Mountains. Legal action concerning abortion during the 49 years since the Roe decision has consisted principally of Republican-sponsored laws restricting access to abortion services and pro-choice legal actions to defeat those laws. But the Republican success in using the abortion issue has resulted in anti-abortion laws in 30 states, and we are now at the stage where the Roe v. Wade decision will be overturned any day now. By the time you hear this message, it may have already been overturned. This will revoke the constitutional right for women that was guaranteed in the 1973 decision. The 2016 election of Donald Trump sealed the fate of the Roe v. Wade decision. Trump, who called himself, quote, pro-choice, during the years leading up to his announcement of his candidacy, changed his position to, quote, pro-life when he became a candidate. He spoke during an interview with Chris Matthews that women must be punished for having abortions. He promised during his campaign that he would install, quote, pro-life, unquote, that is, anti-abortion justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, and he did. This was done with the indispensable help of Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, who was the Senate Majority Leader during Trump's 4-year term as president. This sequence of events was made possible by the fact that McConnell stole a U.S. Supreme Court appointment from President Barack Obama. President Obama nominated Merrick Garland, a U.S. Court of Appeals judge, to fill a vacancy that occurred upon the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in March of 2016. McConnell refused even to have hearings, much less a vote, on the Garland nomination. He held the vacancy open to be filled by Donald Trump after his election and assumption of office in 2017. This permitted Trump to fill 3 vacancies on the Supreme Court in one term, tipping the anti-abortion balance of the court to 6 votes out of 9. This sequence of events was made possible by the fact that Trump got 82% of the white Christian evangelical vote in 2016, permitting him to win the Electoral College majority by 77,000 votes in 3 states out of a total of 139 million votes. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes. In 2020, Joe Biden won both the popular vote and the electoral vote, and Trump never said that he would accept the results of the election if he didn't win, and he hasn't. Republican candidates and secretaries of state throughout the country are now engaged in a concerted effort to control both the popular vote by voter suppression and manipulation of the Electoral College votes to assure a victory of Donald Trump if he runs again for president. This pattern, which puts American democracy at grave risk, threatens to attack a wide variety of public policies and issues, has ominous consequences for women and reproductive freedom in the United States. The state of Texas, with the approval of the U.S. Supreme Court, has already stripped women of their constitutional rights, and this was followed by Oklahoma. This pattern will continue in Republican-controlled states. The recently leaked draft opinion by Justice Alito revealed that the court's impending decision to overturn Roe v. Wade will also diminish or abolish important other rights, including due process, the right of privacy under the Constitution, and equal protection under the law. Alito's draft cites 13th century references, which indicates a stop on the way back to the Dark Ages. Alito is an originalist, which means that he interprets the Constitution in terms of the prevailing reality in the 18th century, just at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, before modern health care, and before modern conveniences such as electricity, motor vehicles, radio, television, and other facts of 21st century life. It is a breathtakingly radical decision that turns the lives of women upside down and hurtles them back several centuries in time. This is the Republican way. The United States is now on a path of minority rule by a fascist, white supremacist Christian theocracy with the elimination of protection of the U.S. Constitution for everyone except heavily armed white Christian men who own property, the condition that prevailed at the beginning of the American Republic more than 2 centuries ago. Access to safe abortion services and modern women's reproductive health care are collateral damage in this interminable conflict. Safe abortion is an essential component of women's health care in the 21st century, and no woman's life and health should be at the mercy of the next election.